Rise of the Floodborn is now fully revealed, and I've got 10 decks for you to take to your locals or any competitive events on day 1. Let's get right into it. The first deck, and probably the most hyped deck going into set 2, is Discard Aggro. Now this deck uses Steel and Emerald combined together for a really annoying deck. So we see lots of new inclusions from Emeralds, which allow you to discard cards from your opponent's hand and draw more cards in the process. We see loads of Flynn Rider cards, we see a new 1 free vanilla, and a new Shift 2, which can quest for 4 with Evasive. This is insane for trying to get some early lore on the board. We also pair this with just the general Steel package that we all know and love from set 1, and we can discard so many cards from our opponent's hand. Now, why do we want to discard these cards? There's a new card called Prince John, which whenever your opponent discards a card from their hand, you draw as many cards as you discard from their hand, meaning that if we use a whole new world to discard their whole hand, we draw 7 new cards of a whole new world, and then draw every card that the opponent's discarded, meaning we can probably draw at least 10 cards from that one card, which will give us so much fuel going into the mid and late game. We also see a new inclusion of Donald Duck, which allows us to draw a card at the start of each turn, which is just insane for just keeping our consistency going. And then we also see this Shift Cheshire Cat, which has Evasive, and you can also exert it to banish any chosen character, which when you combine this with Tinkerbell, which deals 1 damage to everything on your opponent's board, you can just pick and choose what you remove, almost like a Dragonfire with a huge evasive body. And last but not least, the best combo in this deck is to play Bell, and then you can use John Silver to give your opponent's characters Reckless, and then if Bell's the only exerted character on your side of the board, the opponent has to attack into the Bell, discarding their whole hand, meaning that if you also have Prince John, you're discarding that many cards. Overall, I think this deck will be a really strong meta contender going into Rise of the Floodborn, and definitely a really solid deck to pick up on day 1. Carrying on this trend with Emerald being really strong, I've thrown together this Evasives list. We see a lot of new Minnie Mouse cards which allow us to get Evasives out on the board really quickly. We see this 1 free which can quest for 2 Evasive, which is really solid, and then we see this Shift 2 Evasive, which whenever you play a second action in a turn, you get +2 lore, which isn't really important, it's just more going for the turn 2 shift into a solid evasive unit. Once again, we see these Flynn Rider cards. The one that can quest for 4 has Evasive and can also shift for 2, which is really solid. And then again, we see the Donald Duck and Daisy Duck combo, and we also see this new card Ray, which is just a 5-cost evasive quest for free, which is quite solid. We see old favourites like Genie, and we see the Cheshire Cat again. Overall, a really solid evasives list. It's just quite annoying. If the opponent doesn't have an answer for evasives, then you're probably going to pick up a lot of wins, especially in an early meta game. Okay, next up we got one of the most anticipated archetypes. This is going to be Bounce. This deck is surprisingly really solid. We're going to combine the Merlin cards with the Madame Mim cards to allow us to do some crazy things. So we can either play the Merlin Goat cards to gain a lore every time he leaves play and you play the character, which means you can just set up for some really tricky turns for the opponent where they won't know how to react properly. You also see Merlin Rabbit, which does the same thing, but instead of gaining a lore, you draw a card. This is really good for consistency, and honestly, we only need to run 2 Maleficent because of it. And then we see Merlin Shapeshifter, which is a really solid combo late game finisher, where you can rack up some insane lore numbers on this card. We also see Arthur, which is probably one of the most underrated cards in the whole set. Whenever he quests, you can bounce a card back to your hand to gain an additional 2 lore. So you can either bounce back cheap cards like Lilo to protect it and just play it again, or you can bounce back the cards like the Goat and the Rabbit to either gain more lore or draw an additional card. We also see a really good late game finisher at Madame Mim, which has Evasive and also has quest for 4. But you do have to bounce 2 cards back, which can be a downside, but in this deck, you're most likely going to have only the upsides. We also combine this with the Rockstar Stitch package to just have some really explosive late game turns. Next up, we have Amber Sapphire Princess Healing deck. Now this deck seems to be pretty decent. We didn't have too many cheap ways to heal beforehand, but now we've got a couple more cheap healing options. There's a lot more ways for this deck to kind of like go. We also see Shift Rapunzel, which every time you do heal, you get to draw a card. And we also see Grand Pabby, which is an insane finisher, which is every time you heal, you gain 2 lore. And this card can also quest for free itself, meaning that most of the turns where this card's up, you're going to be questing for 5 in those turns, which is really good for a late game card. This deck was kind of working as set 1, but we just didn't really have enough synergies, especially cheap synergies, to make it work. But I feel like with these new cards, this deck definitely has a place in the meta. Back on the discard hype, and we have Discard Midrange. Now this deck uses all the same cards we spoke about to discard cards from your opponent's hand and allow you to draw more cards, but from this time we're pairing it with Amber to give us access to the insane early game of Lilo Simba and the really solid mid game and card draw of Rapunzel. When playing Amber, we also have access to You Have Forgotten Me, which alone just discards 2 cards from your opponent's hand, which is really solid. We also, in this deck, utilize Hypnotize, which allows us to draw a card and discard a card from opponent's hand, which when we have Prince John on the field is drawing us 2 cards. We also use Sudden Chill just as a cheap way to sing a song and discard a card from the opponent's hand, making sure that our Shift Flynn Rider can definitely quest for a large amount. Ramp has been one of those decks that kind of works but doesn't have a really solid end game, which is kind of the whole point of it. With set 2 we see some really big threats for the late game, mainly just Goofy. This card Quest for 4 has 10/10 stats, but does cost 9. Thankfully it's inkable, but the only way to really remove this card is with Dragonfire, and Ruby doesn't look like it's going to be seeing too much play this set. We also have this Cinderella card which can attack ready characters, which is really solid, and also has resist 2, meaning it's going to be insanely sturdy. We still have the likes of Hades to remove stuff from the board, and late game finishers such as Belle. Apart from now, instead of having to ramp up with Detective Mickey Mouse, we see this new Winnie the Pooh card, which allows us to quest and ramp at the same time, and it's inkable. In my opinion, this Winnie the Pooh is going to replace the Detective Mickey in a lot of decks, especially ones that want to ramp quite early. Other than that, we see the standard steel package with Tinkerbell, Beast to remove items, Smash, and just a whole new world to refill your hand to go into these big units later on in the game. Set 2 gave us a lot of ways to reset our units to make them attack a lot more. We see this new legendary Scar which has Rush, and whenever it banishes another character, it readies itself again. Although it can't quest, this is a really solid late game board clear, and when we pair it with the likes of LeFou and Shield of Virtue, all of our units are going to be readying and unreadying and questing and attacking just all turn long, and we're going to get some really solid mid-game boards, and we should just really outvalue our opponent. While we do still see the amber threats such as Surfer Stitch and Rapunzel that we've been seeing for the whole of set 1, we've got some new threats in Christopher Robin, which has the same kind of effect as Stitch, where if you have 2 or more characters, you get to gain 2 lore every time he readies. You can either spam LeFou's or Shield of Virtues to ready Christopher Robin to gain like 6 lore in 1 turn, or you can just kind of leave it there and it will just naturally get a lot of value since it has 6 health and it's going to be quite difficult to remove. We also see Shere Khan, which is a really solid late game finisher. Whenever one of your characters challenges another character, you gain 1 lore, meaning that although your characters are readying and they can't quest, when they're attacking you're still gaining lore, so you can get some really cheeky ways to just get your 20 lore and end the game that way. Okay, I promise this is going to be the last Emerald deck. Basically, we're just going to use a tried and tested combo of Amethyst and Emerald to just play an aggro game plan. Instead of trying to mix 2 inks together, we're just going to use the draw that Amethyst has and the abundance of insane new Emerald cards to just make a really solid aggro deck. And that's basically it for this one. Okay, for the last 2 decks I wanted to take a look at the 2 decks that have been dominating the whole meta in set 1, which we're going to start off with Ruby Amethyst Control. Now there are a lot of new tools that this deck's got. It was quite tight on space originally, but I think now with these inclusions, this is kind of like a really solid 60 to start on. The issue that I had with Ruby Amethyst Control is that you didn't necessarily have a really solid 1-drop to play, but thanks to Felicia, there's a free 1 Reckless, which just gets past a lot of really annoying units that your opponent might have, such as Simba, which we originally needed Gaston for, but if you can play Felicia on turn 1, even going second, you have a way to answer Simba. Again, we have the Shere Khan, which is just going to allow you to attack and clear the opponent's board like you'll want to in a control deck, and just also push our 20 lore win condition. We see 1 new item to add to our massive item pool, which is Dinner Bell, which allows us to exert it, pay 2 ink, and draw cards equal to the number of damage on a chosen character, and then banish them. This gives us a way to draw cards that's not Magic Mirror, and just overall is really solid. You can attack with your Aladdin, gain some lore back from the opponent, and then just draw like 3 cards. Should be quite solid, but it is still needing to be tested. And then the final card to talk about, which is definitely going to make this deck really solid, is Peter Pan Shadow. Now this card has evasive and gives your cards with Rush evasive also. So if you play this card, and then you can play Maui and Rafiki, and you can clear your opponent's evasive units, which just makes the evasive matchup so much easier, which was Ruby Amethyst's like hardest matchup. So finally I've got Amber Steel Songs. This deck hasn't changed too much. Originally when in the deck you kind of wanted to play some solid 6 cost, 5 cost units, things like that. But we didn't really have any strong ones, so we were kind of just playing cards like Cerberus that had stats. But now we see Christopher Robin, which can definitely just replace those cards. It has pretty solid stats and can push your win condition a lot quicker. We also see this Mulan, which whenever you quest, you can reveal the top card of your deck, and if it's a song, you just get to play it for free, which is absolutely insane. So we can either just use Hakuna Matata to heal our whole board, whole new world to just draw a whole new set of cards, be our guest to just draw us an extra character card, or grab your sword to just clear the opponent's board. Overall, really solid card, and I think although this deck hasn't changed much, it will still be quite solid for set 2. So those are my 10 day 1 decks for day 2. Let me know which one was your favourite, and let me know if I've missed any. There are a couple more I do want to cover, but I don't really have a solid list for them yet, so I'm just going to leave it until I do. But other than that, thanks for watching. There will be deck guides coming out very soon. I'll see you in the next one.